The American Civil War killed more soldiers than every other American war before it combined. It produced mass graves, shattered homes, and a new vocabulary for suffering. And yet, as vast as the slaughter was, the war produced remarkably few formal reckonings for atrocities committed on or off the battlefield. Only a handful of men were ever tried by military authorities for crimes akin to war crimes. Among those rare prosecutions, one stands out for the nature of the offenses, the persistence of the violence, and the effort to rewrite the story afterward. This is an inside look at America's most disturbing wartime criminal, Samuel "Champ" Ferguson. This is not an exercise in sensationalism. It is an investigation grounded in trial records, eyewitness testimony, contemporary reporting, and the cautious judgments of historians. What follows traces how a man from a violent border region became a guerrilla leader, how he allegedly moved from pre-war murderous episodes to systematic wartime executions, and how a single military trial in 1865 attempted to hold him to account for a pattern of killings that included men left wounded on the battlefield and patients inside a makeshift hospital. Before we move to the battlefield, a brief note on scope. If you value careful historical investigations, consider subscribing. Stick around. This story will move from the smoke of battle to the wooden floors of a courtroom, and the full picture requires seeing both. Salt was a strategic commodity in the 19th century in ways that seem foreign now. Salt cured meat, preserved food for armies and civilians, and sustained the Confederate war effort by keeping soldiers provisioned through winter. The works at Saltville, Virginia, were a target because destroying them would deny the Confederacy a vital resource. In early October 1864, a Union force moved into southwest Virginia with the express purpose of disrupting those salt works. The assault on Saltville did not go as planned. Union attackers met stiff resistance, and by the end of the engagement, many Union soldiers, exhausted and wounded, were left on the field as units withdrew under pressure. The chaos of a failed assault left a particular kind of vulnerability. Wounded men, some decently dressed in blue but unable to flee, remained where they had fallen or were carried to nearby structures pressed into service as hospitals. Among those left were soldiers of the 5th U.S. Colored Cavalry, African-American troops whose presence on the field introduced another element of danger in a theater where racial animosities were raw and deadly. It was in the aftermath of that failed operation that irregular Confederate fighters conducted a sweep of the battlefield. Some of these men were loosely organized guerrillas, operating outside the strict discipline of the regular army. They moved across the pocked fields looking for survivors. Witnesses and later trial testimony make a grim distinction between the killing of combatants actively engaged in fighting and the deliberate execution of wounded men who posed no further threat. The latter would be the central allegation against Champ Ferguson. Nearby, Emory and Henry College had been turned into a makeshift hospital. Men on litters lay in parlors and classrooms, tended by exhausted medical attendants. It was supposed to be a neutral space, one in which the rules, if imperfectly observed in war, declared sanctuary for the wounded. According to multiple accounts introduced at trial, a group of guerrillas entered that hospital. Among them was Champ Ferguson. The scene witnesses described was precise in its cruelty, if not in every small detail. A man who knew how to find the wounded. A man who, according to testimony, methodically selected particular patients and ordered them killed. One witness later testified that Ferguson went through the rooms and picked out the men that he knew. Another recalled the sight of a rifle placed at the head of a man who could no longer defend himself. Among the victims in that hospital were soldiers of the 5th U.S. Colored Cavalry. Other contemporary reports describe an officer of the Union forces who had once been known to Ferguson being led out and executed. The lieutenant's name appears with variations in the sources. The record is uncertain enough that it must be annotated here as indefinito for verification. These killings at Emory and Henry were not merely collateral violence. Witnesses described them as selective and personal. Trial testimony emphasized that some of the victims were explicitly identified before they were shot. That fact, soldiers targeted while lying wounded in a place serving as a hospital, would later become a prime accusation in the military court that convened to consider Ferguson's conduct. But to grasp how a man could act with such brutality, it helps to look back at the life that shaped him. Samuel Champ Ferguson was born in 1821 in a rough mountainous region along the Tennessee-Virginia border, an area where the line between law and personal retribution was often thin. He was the eldest in a large family, a position that in frontier communities could translate into early responsibility and early opportunities to acquire enemies. Contemporary descriptions portray him as volatile, a heavy drinker, quick to gamble, impatient with slights, and ready to use force. Stories circulated of fights in saloons and of early killings that suggested Ferguson was comfortable with violence long before the Confederate uniform existed. A pivotal pre-war moment came in 1858 during a protracted, violent dispute with the Evans family. Accounts of this confrontation vary in their details: how it began, who fired the first shot, but it ended in bodies. One or more men were killed. Another was mortally wounded. The incident propelled Ferguson into a fugitive's life for a time, and the reputational fallout hardened his sense of grievance. Family members and associates later noted that bitterness from those years followed him into the war. Among the names associated with these pre-war conflicts is James Reed. The historical record links Reed and other local figures to the feuds that plagued the region. Those episodes mattered. They offered both an explanation for Ferguson's later ferocity and a motive for why he might see violence as a tool of personal survival, rather than exclusively as an act of war. When the Civil War expanded the scale of violence, Ferguson returned not as a conventional officer, but as the head of a guerrilla band. Estimates of his following vary. 20 men is a common figure cited in contemporary testimony, but what mattered was how they operated. Guerrillas in that theater practiced a form of irregular warfare that blurred civilian and military lines. Ferguson's band roamed across the borderlands, attacking neighbors they suspected of Union sympathies, ambushing supply lines, and targeting prisoners. Testimony at his trial emphasized a pattern: men summoned from their homes, shot after capture, men attacked while sick in beds, neighbors ambushed on isolated roads. 2 cases, representative and chilling, were emphasized by witnesses. One concerned a man named William Frog, sometimes spelled Frogs in certain records, who was allegedly murdered while confined to his bed with illness. According to testimony, Ferguson and company entered Frog's dwelling and executed him despite his obvious inability to resist. Another account focused on Reuben, sometimes spelled Reuben Wood, a neighbor who reportedly was called to see Ferguson and then shot. These are not isolated anecdotes, but part of an accumulation of episodes that witnesses painted as deliberate, personal, and often carried out with cold efficiency. Rumors grew up around Ferguson. Gruesome stories of mutilations and decapitations circulated in the papers and in soldiers' letters. Such tales had the dual effect of reflecting genuine horror and inflating reputations on all sides. Where the sources are slender or contradictory, the proper historian's stance is caution. Several of the more lurid allegations about severed heads and trophies are reported in contemporary accounts but remain uncorroborated by trial evidence. They must be labeled as reported or unverified. The credible through line is not the most sensational rumor, but the established pattern supported by multiple witnesses. Ferguson targeted those who could not defend themselves, sometimes in their own homes or hospital wards. It is important to stress differences that trial lawyers, judges, and historians have long debated. When does irregular violence cross the line into criminality? Combat by its nature involves killing. But intentionally seeking out the wounded or attacking medical facilities contravenes norms that, however imperfectly enforced in that period, were already part of military custom. Witnesses at Ferguson's court-martial were conscious of that distinction. They drew a clear line between engagements on open ground and the deliberate killing of men who had been disabled or who lay under the protection, however makeshift, of a hospital. Ferguson's relationship with Confederate authorities was ambiguous and at times pragmatic. He sometimes claimed to act under Confederate commission, presenting himself as an officer carrying out partisan warfare against enemies of the Confederacy. That claim, raised at his trial, was crucial to his legal defense. If he had been an authorized Confederate officer, his actions might be judged within the wartime terms and treated as regular military conduct. Prosecutors countered with witness testimony that placed him outside the bounds of regular command and described decisions made by him and his men that did not conform to orders or discipline. On the battlefield and in the hospital, according to prosecution witnesses, Ferguson operated as a man answering private grievances as much as wartime objectives. The episode that forced national attention onto Ferguson came at Saltville in October 1864. After the battle, as Union troops withdrew, guerrillas and local irregulars swept through the area. Accounts collected in 1865 and presented at trial describe bodies being found in ravines and along roads, some clearly victims of the day's fighting and others showing signs of being selected and finished after the firing stopped. Emory and Henry College, the improvised hospital nearby, became an especially singular instance of alleged criminality. Witnesses testified to the presence of Ferguson and his men inside the hospital and to the execution of wounded soldiers. One of the most damning aspects for prosecutors was the number of African American soldiers among the dead. Testimony made clear that black troops were singled out for deadly treatment, a fact that prosecutors argued made the crimes both personally malicious and racially motivated in their execution. Even as guerrilla bands moved through Saltville, regular Confederate units from the mountains, Cherokee troops and other mountain regiments, intervened in ways that suggest even contemporaries recognized limits to Ferguson's conduct. On at least one occasion, mountain troops disrupted a sweep and prevented further killings, according to witness accounts. That interference from Confederate units is meaningful. It underscores that Ferguson was not uniformly acting as an agent of the Confederate military establishment. His actions, even if welcomed by some local citizens, alarmed others in command who were concerned about discipline and broader military objectives. When the war ended, the usual protective cloak for those who had acted violently in the name of necessity began to evaporate. In May 1865, Ferguson was taken into custody by Union authorities. He was transferred to Nashville, where a military commission would examine the breadth of his alleged crimes. The court-martial assembled witnesses from different theaters, soldiers who had been present at Saltville, local citizens who had seen the guerrillas in action, and medical attendants who had tended to the wounded in the improvised hospitals. The trial records show a court trying to piece together multiple incidents across time and place. Dozens of witnesses recounted episodes that, when woven together, presented a portrait of a man who was not merely a reckless partisan, but an accumulator of deliberate killings. The prosecution charged Ferguson with 53 counts. The commission ultimately convicted him on those charges. The testimonies that mattered most were those given by soldiers who had seen men shot after being captured, by hospital attendants who had seen armed men enter wards and remove or select patients, and by neighbors who had experienced the intrusion of Ferguson's band into homes where the sick lay helpless. Ferguson's defense rested heavily on his claimed status as a commissioned Confederate officer and on the chaotic conditions of irregular warfare. He disputed particular allegations, defended his motives as warlike rather than personal, and sought to place his actions inside a military logic. Witnesses for the defense sometimes painted less accusatory pictures, arguing that in the fog of war, events could be misinterpreted. The commission, however, weighed the cumulative testimony, what one historian later described as a system of witness accounts pointing to systematic conduct, and found the weight of evidence sufficient to convict. The sentence was death by hanging. On October 20, 1865, Champ Ferguson was executed. Contemporary reports and later recollections describe his death as protracted. Observers wrote that it took a long time before he was pronounced dead. Afterward, accounts vary about his burial. Some reports indicate his remains were returned to the border region and interred in soil associated with the Confederacy. The specifics of his final arrangements and the exact wording of his last statements remain matters where the record contains variations and where local lore has sometimes elongated the facts. What mattered next, as it often does in the aftermath of civil strife, was how memory shaped the man. Ferguson's case became contested terrain. To some in his home region he was a folk figure, someone who had defended his people against perceived enemies, a man whose earlier feuds were understood in the communal language of honor, and retribution. Those who loved the lost cause found a convenient narrative in which Ferguson's violence was reactive and born of local necessity. To others, and to the prosecutors who sat at the military court in Nashville, he was a murderer who had used the cover of war to pursue private and racially charged vendettas. The process of myth-making is predictable. Stories compress complexity into emblematic moments. For Ferguson, the emblem was the Saltville Hospital and the image of a guerrilla selecting wounded men in a place that should have been protected by the rules of warfare. Revisionist accounts in some post-war publications sought to soften his image, casting his actions as part of a bitterly contested frontier war, claiming he acted under orders or suggesting that some testimonies were unreliable. The trial records, however, present a different counterweight, multiple eyewitnesses testifying to particular acts, often with specificity about dates, locations, and perpetrators. Historians who have examined the transcripts and contemporary reporting tend to view the weight of evidence as compelling that Ferguson exceeded the acceptable norms of war in multiple instances. It is useful at this point to return to the question embedded in the title. What grounds are there for calling Champ Ferguson America's most disturbing wartime criminal? That label is meant to provoke consideration, not to close debate. Several elements together justify the sobriquet more accurately as a claim than as an uncontestable ranking. First, scope and pattern. Ferguson was not alleged to have committed a single isolated murder. The military commission charged him with more than 50 separate acts of killing. Whether the exact number of victims can be settled beyond the convictions is less important than the pattern the witnesses described: recurring acts of lethal violence against those who were not in immediate combat. Second, the nature of the victims. Many of the alleged victims were wounded and incapacitated, or they were men serving in medical facilities. Targeting those who were hors de combat undermines one of the oldest norms of wartime conduct, that wounded men be accorded inhumanity, a measure of protection. When those victims included African American troops, the acts carried not only tactical brutality, but racial terror as well. Third, the method and temperament of the accused. Contemporary testimony and pre-war records depict a man for whom violence was an instrument of choice rather than last resort. The trial hearings revealed episodes that suggested personal vendettas persisted across years and that Ferguson's band often carried out killings with a measure of calculation. That pattern is more disturbing precisely because it blends personal motives with the permissive environment of civil war. Fourth, the post-war contestation. Efforts to recast Ferguson as a hero despite judicial findings underscore how memory can be manipulated and how the failure to account for wartime wrongs can allow violent reputations to be sanitized. The dissonance between trial records and later regional defense of Ferguson is a cautionary tale about how violence gets normalized in certain communal narratives. To be clear, claiming Ferguson as the single most disturbing wartime criminal in American history is a rhetorical move, one that must be hedged with the recognition that other wartime actors elsewhere have committed atrocities that deserve moral condemnation. A more defensible formulation, consistent with the evidence and with the title's directive, is that Champ Ferguson is among the most disturbing figures of the American Civil War, and that his case stands out precisely because he was one of the very few prosecuted for such wartime murders. The rarity of prosecutions during the Civil War makes his conviction and execution a noteworthy instance of accountability in an era when most acts of brutal violence passed without formal legal reckoning. Across the trial transcripts and the contemporary reporting, certain facts remain firm. Witnesses placed Ferguson in the vicinity of particular killings. He claimed a commissioned status that the court found inadequate to shield him. He was convicted on multiple counts and executed in October 1865. Other claims associated with his reputation, decapitation tales, certain precise body counts beyond the 53 counts of conviction, are reported in secondary sources but are not uniformly corroborated by trial evidence. Those details deserve caution and further research. The broader moral underline here is unambiguous. War magnifies human tendencies toward cruelty and revenge. The social ruptures of a civil war magnify them further. because neighbors may sit on different sides of a line that yesterday had not existed, and because the legal and moral orders that might restrain violence break down. Ferguson's story is not merely a story about one man. It is a story about how personal grievance, opportunism, racial hatred, and the permissiveness of irregular warfare can combine to produce acts that stand apart even in a war of extraordinary brutality. It is also a story about the limits of justice. That Ferguson was tried and executed demonstrates that, even in the wake of enormous national trauma, authorities sometimes sought legal accountability. But the fact that only a handful of men were prosecuted for wartime atrocities points to the many who never faced the bar. Memory, therefore, becomes another battlefield. Those who sought to defend Ferguson after the war did so by appealing to local loyalties, reinterpreting testimony, and emphasizing retaliatory motives. Those who study the trial records see something less ambiguous, a pattern of repeated acts against helpless individuals documented by multiple witnesses and tried in a military court that found the evidence sufficient for the gravest penalty. As viewers consider this case, several practical details may help orient further inquiry. The battle and massacre took place in early October 1864 at Saltville, Virginia. The makeshift hospital involved was Emory and Henry College. Some of the dead included members of the 5th U.S. Colored Cavalry. The military court that tried Ferguson sat in Nashville in 1865 and convicted him on 53 counts. His execution took place on October 20, 1865. For names that remain uncertain in the record, most notably a lieutenant whose name is reported with variations in the sources, please note indefinido until further fact-checking can confirm the correct spelling and identity. In the end, the story of Champ Ferguson forces a set of questions that reach beyond any single man. How do societies distinguish between sanctioned violence and murder in wartime? How are the norms of medical sanctity enforced in the midst of irregular warfare? How do personal vendettas survive the imposition of national conflict? And how does law respond when a war itself has eroded those restraints? History offers no quick absolution. It offers instead the messy, often stubborn testimony of courts, the fragments of eyewitness memory, and the ongoing contest over who gets to tell the story. Champ Ferguson's case is a stubborn one. The court found him guilty of 40-plus killings. The witnesses described assaults on wounded men and on hospital wards. Later defenders sought to reshape those facts into a different narrative. Taken together, the pattern of evidence explains why many historians and legal scholars point to his case as among the most disturbing wartime criminal episodes in American history. If this investigation raised questions for you, and if you have a tip for another story we should explore, the description below has a link where you can suggest future topics. If you want to support deeper research and get early access to episodes, consider our Patreon. Above all, remember that the work of history is rarely finished. It is a dialogue between evidence and interpretation, and it matters because our understanding of the past shapes how we judge violence in the present. Thank you for watching.